And I'm at Mount Allison University. I've been at Mount A for about 16 years. Prior to that, I worked for the National Research Council and the Department of Education. I've been in the field of e-learning for a little over 20 years. I teach sociology and also a bit of psychology. And I currently teach at Open Acadia, and I also teach online at Mount Allison. And of course, all of us are thinking about fall, maybe even beyond that, what we're going to do in terms of our teaching. And of course, for many folks who haven't taught online before, it's a new experience. It's a different space in many ways. So we're going to talk a little bit today about some design principles for online learning. So I'm going to first share my screen. And so we're going to look at some design principles for what I say here parenthetically are excellent and engaging online learning. Well, the first thing I actually want to say is that really, when we're thinking about design principles for our course, really online and face-to-face are not that different. And so I'm hoping that that provides you with a bit of encouragement and you feel a bit more comfort in knowing that. There may be some differences in terms of technology, of course. There may be differences even sometimes in terms of strategies. But basically, we're going to notice that a lot of what I'm saying to you today with regards to these design principles are things that you're probably already doing in a face-to-face environment. So the first thing, encourage contact between students and faculty. So basically, what does this mean? It means be there for their questions, be there for their comments, and also be there for feedback. So students need to know, for example, how to contact you online. Meet somebody. Okay. So if, for example, in my courses online, I provide multiple ways for students to contact me. That can be email, that can be Teams, a forum, even my phone number. And I actually do give them my cell phone number. Sometimes maybe not everyone feels totally comfortable doing so, but I have to admit, I rarely get calls from students. Once in a while, I do simply when they need a particular level of support and they don't really want to do it through Teams. They want to ask about an assignment and they want to create a detail. But also post times when you're available, for example, maybe for a chat during, say, virtual office hours. My experience has been, and I've been using virtual office hours for many, many years, that in fact, not a lot of people actually, a lot of students actually use the online virtual office hours, but the fact that they are there and available means that you are there and available, and it communicates to the students that in fact that you value that interaction, you value the communication with them. All right. Related to that is developing reciprocity and cooperation among students. And my take on things is that online courses really shouldn't be independent study classes. For those of us who believe that and ascribe to the notion that people learn through socially constructing based on their experiences, based on their previous knowledge, based on the current knowledge, that's a particularly important thing to do. It's important to get students basically to engage with one another. Um, you can build in collaborative structures into the courses to promote student-to-student interaction. And I think that's really important, specifically when we think about many of our universities, which are small, undergraduate residential universities. It's kind of been the backbone of our pedagogical approach has been this kind of communication between faculty and students that I mentioned in the previous slide, but also among students as well. And I think that's one of the struggles that many of us are facing as we think about the fall, as we migrated for the last few weeks of the winter term to classes and for our spring and summer classes as well. And it's difficult to do, of course, in really short order when you're told you have a week to put together the last 2 or 3 weeks of your course. But hopefully, with a little more time, we can develop some of those and incorporate those into courses for the fall. Well, that gets me thinking about active learning and encouraging active learning. Really, students must actively engage with the content in thoughtful and proposive or proposeful ways. Um, Learning really shouldn't be a passive activity for students. And again, this relates to the previous slide, which is about cooperation among students. Really, they need that active learning to engage and to sort of solidify their learning. So as you develop your online courses, consider ways that you can build active learning into your course content and into the assignments that you might develop and just into the environment. So that can include things like discussion forums for students. It can include the lesson. It can include H5P, which some of you were introduced to with Scott a couple of weeks ago. So thank you, Scott, very much for that. It can also include other tools like Beyond and Animoto. And those are tools for creating engaging, interactive content by yourself or by students. So that's something for us to think about to encourage that active learning. Now, I also want to say that it doesn't necessarily just have to use technology. For example, I'm thinking about someone who might be teaching science, and maybe there are active learning labs, let's say, or activities that you can get students to do in their homes using some common or everyday kinds of materials. Now, in a webinar that I attended way back in early April, some folks out in Lethbridge in their labs were actually sending out materials to their students that they could use to have labs in their homes. So materials that they might need to replicate, I guess, a lab experience. So think about those things. You can even get students to go out. Now we do have social distancing or physical distancing still in place, but maybe in a psych class or a social class, you could have students go out and do observational work, again, with some physical distancing. Again, you're probably seeing a lot of alignment again with face-to-face classes. Give prompt feedback to students. That's particularly important when it comes to an online environment because you can kind of be lost, online if you are not present. And giving prompt feedback to students is part of having that presence. Now, you can do things like create quizzes that can be automatically graded. And those automatically graded quizzes, of course, can allow you to provide feedback to the students, not just about whether their answers are correct or whether they're incorrect, but why their questions may be incorrect. You can give them overall feedback. With most learning management systems, you can provide all kinds of feedback to the student. So that automates things in a way. And the reason I mention that is if you have a class of 200 students, it might be difficult to give them personalized feedback. And that's a way of giving them more automated, yet still slightly personalized without overwhelming you as an instructor. Perhaps you can also use some smaller assignments that will not take as long to assess. So this is where rubrics can be very handy. I use rubrics in my classes. I've been using them for years. You can set those rubrics up generally in your learning management system and just click. So you have your rubric set up, you select on your rubric the appropriate level of achievement, and the students can get feedback in that way. And often I will also give a little bit of individualized feedback as well. So that's another way with some nice smaller assignments using some rubrics. Maybe even things like graded forums. This is another thing that I use as well with simple 2 or 3 value grades. So again, you don't have to provide immediate personalized feedback in a sense, but you're giving them prompt feedback and immediate kind of feedback. So that can be really handy. Now, these are in conjunction, hopefully, if you have classes that are more manageable with giving students individual feedback. So leverage anything that you can within your learning management system to make this kind of happen. All right, our fifth item has to do with emphasizing time on task. So it's often the case that with our online courses, we may be doing asynchronous delivery. There's a lot more flexibility. There may be a flexible schedule. but that doesn't mean that it won't require a significant time commitment on behalf of the students. So we need to make certain that even though we have this fantastic flexibility that may be built in, that instructors communicate time commitments, but also be realistic about their expectations. So for example, be careful about assigning an overwhelming amount of content. So have high expectations, but respect students' time, respect their need to have time to interact with content, interact with one another, and also to reflect and to basically digest. So I also want to, a colleague of mine says, beware the tyranny of content. And I've always liked that because we have to be careful about not associating rigor with the amount of content. Couple of other quick things. Communicate high expectations. I've mentioned this a little bit already with the time on task. So it's important to have high expectations for students. It's also really important or critical that these expectations are clearly communicated to students. It's also helpful to communicate clear expectations for participation and also for interaction. I was just in a meeting or a session earlier this morning, and we were talking about netiquette, for example. And that's something you might want to think about. What are your what's your framework? What are the conditions for engagement, let's say? And students, if you want to, you can have students create them themselves rather than you creating them and posting them. But I often, I have to admit, I create them mostly myself and post them. So that's another thing for us to think about. Could be even things like, are emoticons allowed on your message boards? Are video questions allowed? Are they encouraged? Maybe. So there are lots of things that you can think of in terms of communicating those high expectations, but also how you communicate to one another. All right. One last thing. And that is to, I'm laughing at my own slide with the Muppets, respect and address diverse ways of learning, which kind of starts to align with some universal design principles that many of you may be thinking about these days as we move to an online environment. So students certainly learn in a variety of ways. We know that from quite a bit of research. And while undoubtedly there will be some text-based content with your online courses, really, hopefully it's not your only delivery mode. It's not your only way that you assess. So draw on multimedia options available online, not just to deliver content to students, but also to maybe assess them. So instead of typing out a long lesson on the Middle Ages, for example, you could maybe find a YouTube video. Maybe, in fact, you can ask students, if I'm thinking back to those tools I was mentioning earlier, like Beyond and Adamoto, maybe you allow students to create those as their final assignments or final projects for a class. So you can do those kinds of things, students can do those kinds of things with less and less need for immersive, by immersive I mean complex, I should say, technologies. Right, you can do things with QuickTime, you can do things with Screencast-O-Matic, and those kinds of things as well that are pretty easy for students to use these days. All right. So one last little thing, I'm going to talk a little bit about alignment because I think it's important as we think about our design principles. Think about your learning outcomes or more specifically learning outcomes for your classes, for your students. As dodgy a term as outcomes or goals might be, I still think it's important for us to think about what do we want our students to know? What do we want them to do or be able to do? And what do we want them to value by the end of a course? Now, once you have that in mind, what do I want them to know, do, and value? What kinds of learning activities am I going to create that are going to help me achieve those? So what are the students actually doing? What opportunities do they have to gain that knowledge, to develop those skills, and perhaps even apply their learning? And finally, when you're thinking about it, think about assessment. So, okay, how am I going to assess this? How am I going to measure the student knowledge, the student, let's say, mastery of those particular of that knowledge, that doing, and that valuing. Okay. So that's all I have to say at this moment with regards to some of those design principles. I think you probably noticed quite a bit of, speaking of alignment, quite a bit of alignment with what many of us already do face to face. So again, I'm hoping as a result, it's not too onerous or overwhelming to you, and that in fact, it kind of all fits into place. We do clearly have a few things to learn in terms of some of this technology. I just demonstrated that a moment ago when in fact I couldn't have my Word document displayed at the same time as my PowerPoint on my two screens and had to email it to myself and open up another document. Nonetheless, hopefully it won't become too onerous for us or too overwhelming for us. Now, I want us to do some breakouts. I have to admit, some others were doing this for some sessions for the Maple League Virtual Teaching and Learning Center sessions we've been having over the last month, and I really like this idea. And this is a good way of modeling what you might do in some of your classes, especially if you're doing synchronous delivery. And I want us to think about those 7 principles I just talked about. So I want you to think about very practical ways in which you might do some things in your classes to address these things. So by the way, when you go into your breakout group, what's going to happen is you'll be prompted and be told which group you're in. You'll see a message that reads blue jeans breakout and then your group. So your group might be encourage contact between students and faculty. Your group might be encourage active learning, that kind of thing. So why don't you each discuss what you might do in your classes, bounce ideas off one another, think about what might be really important for you to try to achieve some of these design principles, let's say. Then I think we'll be able to do that for probably, let's say 15 minutes. I know some people have done 10 in the past, but 10 sometimes has a tendency to be a little short. At least in the experience this last month, people were saying, oh gosh, I'm out of time already. So let's try 15 minutes. And that will hopefully give you enough time to chat about these things. I'm also going to encourage you to stick around. So we have noticed that sometimes with these breakouts, people think, oh gosh, I've learned the design principles, now I'm going to leave. It really would be fantastic if you could stay and if you could engage in the breakout groups and chat with one another. After that 15 minutes, we'll get back together and we'll have someone or someone's, we'll have folks basically report on some of the things that they talked about in their breakout groups, some of the ideas that they think were particularly important or helpful, and that will probably bring us around to close to the end of our time. But before we do that, maybe, Heather, we should see if there are any questions before we continue on our merry way to our breakout groups.
Yeah, and just one thing that I'd like to add is that Blue Jeans only gives you 10 seconds before you're prompted to leave the breakout room. So the first thing I would recommend doing is assign someone to share out at the very end, but then also assign someone to keep an eye on the time, just to count 15 minutes, say 12:37 or 11:37, depending on where you're joining.
Great. Yes. Blue Jeans is a little abrupt, 10 seconds and you're out. We can't give a 1-minute warning, it seems. So, okay. Any questions, comments, thoughts, ideas, encouragements?
I had a question actually. You mentioned about graded forums. What did you mean by that? Like you're talking about sort of online message boards or group discussions, or what did you mean there?
Yeah, that's exactly what I meant. I meant the online forums that you can create for students. You can set them up as group forums. You can set them up as a forum for the entire class. And increasingly, most learning management systems, and we're all using Moodle in our 4 Maple League institutions. So as a result, on the forums, of course, you can text. So you can use text. You can type questions that students might pose to one another or to the instructor. But you can also add images. You can also add and embed videos. And also, over the last couple of years, there's a video recording option that's built right into Moodle. So you don't have to have anything special. The student doesn't have to know anything special. They just click on the little icon that looks like a video camera, and they have 2 minutes to record either their questions or comment or responses. So the forums are rather robust, and they can actually be much more than just text based.
How do you sort of imagine grading these things? Though? Is it just a kind of participation mark, or
Yeah, so well, you can do different things. So one of the things that you can actually do is you can actually grade them individually. So you can grade them on, again, I was thinking about feedback being practical, even though you want to give them timely feedback. You also don't want to spend too much time responding to these things. So you can do it a couple of ways, and I have in the past. One is unless the student hears back from me that their participation is not up to par. For example, they post a question. Let's say I require that they post a question every week, but the question is really simplistic and really not thoughtful. I'll email them and just say, just letting you know your your questions really need to be more developed or advanced. And but nonetheless, what I will do is just add them all up. So someone's posted 12 questions, they were asked to do 12 questions, and on that part of the participation, they might get full marks. But the other thing you can do, again in Moodle, is that your forums can be graded with just a simple drop down. So your drop down could be something simple like 0, 1, 2. It could be something like satisfactory, good, and excellent. So simple ways in which you can just do a quick click and give the feedback in that kind of way.